I'm John Atack, and I'm delighted to welcome Kelvin Pierce. Hi, Kelvin.
Hi, John. Good to see you again.
You wrote a, I think, remarkable book called The Sins of My Father, about your father, who was a neo-Nazi fundamentally, and the author of the Turner Diaries, one of the most dangerous books of our time. And I mean, I've spent a lifetime studying authoritarian beliefs and groups, what people call cult groups, and totalitarian authoritarians that are right to the extreme. It's concerned me watching from afar what's been happening in the United States with a swing towards what used to be called white supremacism and is now, by its advocates, being called white nationalism. They have this idea of separating themselves off, believing themselves to be a pure ethnicity of some kind, an Aryan people or something like this, which is genetically absolute nonsense. But the uprising of this sort of thinking came along with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and this is something that you and I share pretty much, I think, the same view about. So why don't you open up the subject of Donald Trump and what you think of him and what you think his relationship is to the alt-right or whatever we're calling it at the moment?
Well, I mean, I think Donald Trump, well, again, I really can't say anything good about that man. But I think he does have certain strengths. And I think one of the strengths that he has is that he was able to identify certain fears that are in our society and to take advantage of that and to use that for his gain and for his advantage, and to grab power and to hold on to power and try to increase that power. I think that some of the stuff that he may say, he may believe, I mean, I do believe that probably at heart he's a racist, but I don't think that his political ambitions have anything to do with race. I think his political ambitions only have to do with his ego and enriching himself, family. But, there's been hundreds, thousands of years in history where demagogues, people like Donald Trump, have used a certain playbook, which is basically to, whip up the fear of the other and to distract, the masses so that they're thinking about something that they think is a danger to them, like immigration or the other, a different race or a different religion, or somebody from a different country or whatever, and to be able to talk in a way so that people are able to put all their blame, everything that's not going right in their life, anything that they feel bad about, and even when they feel bad about themselves, it makes it easier for them to blame the other instead of looking inside and figuring out what's really going on. And I think Donald Trump and the people that he surrounded himself with did a fairly good job of that during the 2016 election cycle. And I think that, the biggest thing that came out of that whole cycle and everything that Donald Trump did and he said is that he took a massive amount of latent racism in our country, which has always been there.
Yeah.
And he just made it politically unassailable. He made it okay for people to voice it out loud instead of to keep it as a silent little conversation in their head. Now, instead of, being closet racist and being racist by themselves, it was okay for them to broadcast that publicly because Donald Trump made that okay.
I think it's a very significant point that you said that you wrote your book because of Donald Trump's ascent, and that you saw that he was quite openly saying things that when your father said them were seen as racist and were seen as being neo-Nazi. And Donald Trump has given a legitimacy to groups like the Ku Klux Klan or the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers. So that they, as you say, the fear of the other, when your own life is not working out properly, it's so much easier to blame something else, So the idea, and I do believe there is tremendous political corruption in the world. I'm not in the least bit naive about that. And I don't believe that it has a tag that says Democrat or Republican. I'm not convinced of the authenticity of all politicians. I believe that there are a number of politicians, and probably more politicians than in other places, who are self-serving, who do what they do for self-aggrandizement and for power. I don't, however, I haven't come to the point of view that I think, that 100% of politicians are evil people, but I do think far too many of them are. And Donald Trump, Eric Fromm put forward the idea that, and he gave us the first definition of a malignant narcissist. And he put forward the idea that Freud was wrong, that narcissists are not people who love themselves, they're people who can't love. They don't know how to love. They've not matured to full adult responsibility in the world. And so they grab things for themselves and they want to be adulated by others. They want other people to, think that the gold that everything they have is covered in is real gold, that they really are superior in some way. And Trump's a strange creature, isn't he? Because he's partly pure celebrity, that he's always courted the press. He's always put forward this attitude, sort of like Kim Kardashian or someone, where there is no substance. When I've now watched tens of hours of documentary about Trump in the last 7 years, 6-7 years, and he never seems to say anything, which really concerns me. In fact, he has tremendous problems with grammar. It's very rare for him to actually finish a sentence and stay in the same tense that the sentence began in, which is said to be a typical effect of psychopaths. In fact, they have linguistic problems, but,
Well, I mean, I think that the reason why he really doesn't say anything of substance is he really doesn't have anything of substance to say. No. And I think that, instead of looking at the politicians, at least for me in this country, what they're doing is they are distracting us. They're distracting us to focus on the hatred of the other, instead of focusing on the fact that our political system, the system itself, is inherently corrupt. Yeah. And that if we were to really focus on what's important, like income equality and affordable health care and our environment and protecting our future generations, if we were to focus on that sort of stuff, then what would happen to all our politicians who their campaign chest, their pockets are all lined by the lobbyists, that can spend millions, if not billions of dollars a year furthering their interest, the NRA, things like that. Our political system is massively corrupt. It's completely broken and corrupt. And that's the reason why we have all these problems in our country. It's not because of immigration. It's because of corporate greed, which actually basically buys our political system, and it furthers their goals, which is to become even, more rich and greater income inequality. I think that is the crux of the whole problem, right there. And it probably could be said for other countries in the world as well, but for the United States, Democrat, Republican, independent, whatever, our system, the way it is now, is completely broken and completely corrupt. And I don't see anything changing that unless, I think something incredible will have to happen for that to change.
We have seen such things. I'm not a supporter of Emmanuel Macron, but he, within 1 year, put together the En Marche political party and took control of the French government with himself as president and, you know, a huge following. I'm not at all happy. I think so many people have bought into this neoliberal stance. And I don't think it's almost a religious belief, things like the free market, which is something I've never actually seen, but it's held forth as an idea of, that everything will work if we just let the market, we close our eyes and let the market control everything. We will, however, still have tariffs and subsidies, even though we're pretending to have a free market. And so we get political ideologies and politicians who seem, some of them are cynical and others of them blindly believe that, this is the way forward. However, with Macron, it does show that it is possible, even in a very large country like France, for the political system to change almost overnight. And I do see a problem in the US that, and here, that you have polarized systems with just really two powerful political parties.
Yeah, that's been a problem for a very long time. Nobody has ever been able to crack those two parties or to, compete against them. And I think the system is set up that way. I think, there's a reason for that. But I think it also is interesting that, these neo-Nazi groups or white supremacist groups or white nationalist groups, they all supported Trump, even though Trump, didn't give a damn about them, didn't really care about them. And, those groups all purport that, hey, we're the master race, we're the only ones, the only true white people in the world are from Northern Europe, blah, blah, blah. But look at Northern Europe. They happen to have the happiest people in the world because they have governments that are completely opposite of our governments. They actually do have concern and care for their environment. They do have care and concern for their citizens. They do have care and concern for future generations. And I mean, they're not perfect by any means, but on a scale of the United States versus, Finland or Norway or something like that, there's just a night and day difference with how those people govern and how the people as citizens feel about their government and feel about, what they're doing in the world. It's just night and day difference.
And there are incredible differences. So
how do you reconcile that?
The highest income, or the wealthiest country in the world is the USA, but something like 25% of the population live below the poverty line, which is worse. I believe higher than any European country.
Yeah, and look at our incarceration rate.
Yeah, a few years ago, California shifted, I think it was 85,000 convicts to another state to be housed. That is more than the complete number of people incarcerated in the United Kingdom, which is about 80,000. So just one state was its surplus prison population was that. And there's no rehabilitation in the prisons. The prisons are just hot houses where you can learn more criminal activities while you're waiting to be unleashed on the street again.
Yeah, our politicians tell us that that's making us safer.
Yeah, and it is.
It's the exact opposite. I mean, our country is like probably one of the most dangerous civilized countries to live in. I mean, you have a much higher chance of getting shot just out on the streets now with all these mass killings going on. I mean, I travel to Eastern Europe on a regular basis, and I go to an Eastern European country. I feel safer walking by myself in the middle of the capital city of one of those Eastern European countries in the middle of the night. I feel much safer doing that. And I would not do that in any major US city.
Yeah.
When dare do that?
Shinzo Abe was shot in Japan the other day. A commentator came on television and he gave an interesting statistic. He said, I think there are 127 million people in Japan, and we record about 10 gun deaths a year. So,
Yeah, what, maybe 10 an hour or 10 a minute?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, seriously.
And I mean, I think the kind of the notion of the Wild West, this idea of being a pioneer and fighting your way through everything, it seems to be, or the fiction of it seems to be written into American culture. The reality of the West, I think probably Deadwood, the TV series, comes closest to what it was really like, where life was nasty, brutish, and short. And that sort of sense of a pioneer spirit, it's led us to ridiculous contradictions. I mean, I watched Ken Burns' The West, which was actually, I think, made by a guy called Stephen Ives, but and not to the same standard, frankly, of Ken Burns' other work, but nonetheless, there were pieces of history that were unknown to me. So finding out that when the Mormons, the Latter-day Saints, moved to Salt Lake City, it was still part of Mexico. And for me, geographically, that was, seeing how far north that is, to see just how much territory was absorbed so quickly from the late 1840s, after the Louisiana Purchase, and then the annexation of parts of Mexico and the purchase of California. And ultimately, I think the Alaska from the Russians, which I hear they want back now, and a bit late, I'd have thought, and the Oregon Territory, which was still actually held by the British Crown into the 50s. But you've certainly got this massive place with so many peoples. In the 1880s, universal education was introduced in the US with the intention of homogenizing the population. And it's the only place that I know of in the world where people are labeled according to an ethnicity that predates them, their families coming to the US. So have Italian Americans, African Americans, Greek Americans, Korean Americans. So that distinction and separation. What we tend to find in the UK is that somewhere in the third generation, people are just English or Welsh or Scottish or what have you. And at the moment in our contest for the leadership, the leadership of the country, now that Boris Johnson has fallen, two of the people are standing. In fact, if Priti Patel joins in, three of the people are standing are actually of South Asian descent. And in this country,
really?
Yeah, okay, fine. So what? We have a lot of senior politicians of varying ethnicities, and we don't have a society that's as deeply riven by really by racism as the US.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's almost at the genetic level in our country. We are born and bred and taught racism from the day we can learn. It's passed on from generation to generation, and I'm starting to see that change, because I noticed when my two daughters, when they were in elementary school, they had people from all over the world in their class, and they never mentioned to me like, oh, this is Asian or this is Black or whatever. They were just their fellow classmates. And, that's the newest generation. So, maybe there's hope, but I know that in my generation, when I was growing up, especially being taught by my dad, everybody was labeled by the color of their skin or what country they came from.
Which is a bizarre label. And genetically, of course, when we get down into the DNA, the geneticist Adam Henderson has written a couple of books about this, but we all have little bits and pieces of the whole genetic diversity of humanity within us. So as soon as Neanderthal genes were being detected in the majority of Homo sapiens, you're saying that the interbreeding is intense. There are no Aryans, there are no pure Slavs. Of course, at the moment, Putin is being driven by his demagogue, Alexander Dugin, who preaches this idea of the Eurasian people. That now, when you look back through history and you look at, just say, take it back to the Roman Empire, that people were coming down from the Russian steppe and going all the way through Europe. The Alans, the Sueves, the Vandals are the ones who are remembered, who actually, it was the Romans who were Vandals. The Vandals just went to Rome and said, if you don't give us your stuff, we'll tear the place down. And so the Romans meekly gave them their stuff. And then when they'd gone, started accusing them of being Vandals. They subsequently, of course, went to Carthage and completely destroyed the Vandal civilization. But those Vandals came from Russia. So that means that the people of North Africa, in fact, have a Russian origin. The people of the UK, we know there were two peoples who moved in here, one group from the Ukraine and the other from the Middle East. And that's how the Britons before the Celts moved in. So you've got all of this racial intermixing that's happening all through Europe. There are very few, in fact, I think the UK is the only place not to have changed its boundaries in the last 100 years. You know, countries like Czechoslovakia rose up out of nowhere, uniting people who came apart, and you have the Slovak and the Czech part of it now. But that the idea of racial purity is something that very much belongs to somewhere around the year 1900. It's around then that William Du Bois, the American anthropologist, points to the religion of whiteness, the term he uses. Now, he was black and incredibly clever. And he said, well, actually, when you look through history, this notion of whiteness is very modern. It's something that seems to come along. He put it to the end of the 18th century. I don't think anybody can get it much earlier than the middle of the 17th century. Nobody thought about other people in those terms. The fact that the Navy fought under Nelson at Trafalgar included a large amount of black sailors. That was normal. And then you start, it's said that as Christians started to convert slaves in the 18th century, particularly in the US and the West Indies, that you could no longer think of these people as inferior because they were not Christian, because they were heathens. And so now it became the idea, as they were being dominated and bullied, that they were inferior because of their skin color. And it really, there's no literature up until the 17th century really talking much about skin color. There's perhaps Othello by Shakespeare, but
well, I think that whole idea of inferior or superior, whatever, is just a term or an idea that they use to justify their hatred of the other. I think it's more the difference in just the way the person looks, the way the person chooses to dress, the way the person chooses to do their hair, the way the person, the way they were brought up with their culture, because there's so many widely different cultures throughout our world, and all those are reasons for people to be afraid and to make themselves feel superior and the other to feel inferior. To justify that fear, they have to come up with some sort of rationale. And the white supremacists, of course, has come up with the rationale that, non-whites are inferior, and they're intellectually inferior, they're racially inferior, and they're trying to bring down the white race because they're mixing with the white race, which is going to bring down our level of superiority. And
yeah, and absolutely. And of course, it begins, all of this particular contemporary polarization seems to begin just before the First World War, around about 1900, in Austro-Hungary. That what's happening is that there's a profound upset going on within their society, which becomes evident in the military because people don't speak the same language. And so the military has to be, you have Magyars in the Hungarian, you have Czechs speaking Czech, all within this one empire. And this gives rise to this idea of purity. So you have the pan-Slavic movement, which is
Mhm.
why Russia's in Ukraine right now. This, you know, so it's an idea that's more than 100 years old, and its origins are in Slavic peoples trying to separate themselves out from German people, but the separation is one of language. It's most certainly not genetic. That you know, if you test Hungarians, they may well speak Magyar, but genetically now they'll have the same mixture that we all have. We all have bits and pieces of, you know, I mean, when the Golden Horde came out of Mongolia, it is said that you know, a huge proportion of the world's population have Genghis Khan as an ancestor, because you know, he was an atrocious and awful human being who raped a lot of women. And so what are we going to do about that? You know, what does that make of us, that we're all this kind of jigsaw, this mosaic of genetic characteristics? And what we know about genetics is that the more intermixing, the stronger the species becomes. So at the moment in the world, if a disease comes up that can take the Cavendish banana, there won't be any more bananas, because there is only one species of banana, whatever they're, you know, whether they're red or yellow. Yeah. And so by diversity, we become stronger. We know this. But instead, we have people who are pretending a past. You know, you have Wotanists and identity Christians and people who've actually, you know, pretty much like the Amish, say, the Mennonites, that in the 17th, they're stuck in the 17th century. They're, you know, but, or you know, Hasidic Jews, they're stuck in the late 17th, early 18th century when they came into being. They don't go back to the temple. You know, I co-authored a chapter for a book called Psychiatry and Anti-Semitism. And I just got stuck on this term anti-Semitism. What does it mean? It's being opposed to what? And the word originally, a Semite, a Shemite, a descendant of Shem, would mean the Arabs and the Jews, the Habiru, the Hebrews. It means the Babylonians. That they are, and now the word Semite has come narrowly to mean people who are Jewish. So what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean anything genetically, because Jews can be black, white, or indifferent. So it's not a genetic thing. And it looks as if the people who've moved to Israel really are descended from Europeans, from Khazars. And it genetically, in the last few years, information has come, they're basically testing Palestinians, and they're saying, and they're looking at them linguistically and culturally, and they're saying, it appears that the Jews stayed in Judea and Israel and converted to Islam. Now, what do we mean by Semitic? What do we mean by anti-Semitic? 40% of Jews don't believe in God. And sorry, 40% of Israelis don't believe in God. So it's not a religious thing. It's, I don't think it's a religious thing. Pushed into being this identity, you know?
Yeah, I mean, anti-Semitism has been so pervasive for so long. I mean, if you look at the, what was that document?
The Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Yeah. I mean, and how that was used. I mean, it was what, first written in Russia?
It was first written in the 1860s by a Frenchman, and it was about Napoleon III.
Oh, that was like a satire, right? But then they changed it.
Then the Cheka, the Russian, you know, the earlier KGB,
he used it to,
they just rubbed out certain words and put in Zionist.
Exactly.
There was a court case about it in Switzerland, which exposed all of it, and yet it's still distributed.
Yeah, and Hitler, you know, read that.
Yeah.
And he used that as justification for, you know, what he did. I mean, he used that as absolute justification. My dad completely believed in that document. He believed it was true. He believed that that conspiracy was actually happening in the world. And there, I don't necessarily, I mean, for me, when I look at it, I'm like, is this really about race? Or is this really about an idea of a group of people who happen to be successful at certain things in life in that you decide you're going to target them for that, and you're going to lay all of the ills of society on that group of people. And it's just a massively convenient target.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm, you know, for my dad, I mean, he believed everything that was going on wrong in the world and in America and with the white race, and everything was due to Jews.
Mm.
I mean, if you had any kind of conversation about any subject in the world with my dad, he would tie it back to Jews were the cause of this, unless it was something good.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a very fine book by the historian Norman Cohn. I have a copy of it here, called Warrant for Genocide. And
Okay.
Cohn was a historian of the Middle Ages. He wrote Europe's Inner Demons, about the witchcraft craze. He wrote The Pursuit of the Millennium, about, particularly around the time of the Crusades and the millenarian movements, who believed that Jesus was on his way back any minute, and all he had to do was kill as many Jews as possible. So this is, you know, every T is crossed, every I is dotted about the history of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I proposed to a friend of mine that he should read this book, because he was, you know, convinced by the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He said, oh, he's called Cohen, he's Jewish, I can't trust him. And it's sort of, but this will tell you the library in Switzerland where you can find the original of this book, published, I think, in 1863, long before there were any Zionists. You know, the text, you know, in fact, Zionism is not a Jewish movement. It started among, because to find out what anti-Semitic meant, I went and read a couple of books about Jewish history. Zionism is a term that came about in the 1620s among English Puritans, because they interpreted Revelation as saying that only when the Jews go back to Zion, Jerusalem, and convert to Christianity will Jesus return. And this would be farcical if it were not for the involvement in the Iraq wars of end days Christians like the Bush family, who really do believe that you have to get, you know, everything, you know, Armageddon has to be started off in the Middle East. And we came very close to it, the awful mess that was left there, you know, that allowed ISIS to, you know, basically recruit the Republican Guard and take a huge piece of territory and commit terrible atrocities. All out of these beliefs. I mean, on that side with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, it's the belief in Dar al-Islam, that it is, you know, in the same way that Jews will say that the Bible gives them Israel, so Muslims, a tiny proportion of Muslims, the Salafis, the Wahhabis, make up about 0.5% of the Muslim population. That's where Al-Qaeda came from. But they believe in this absurd idea that the outer limits of Dar al-Islam, the land of Islam, should be regained. And that until that happens, they're continually at war. And it just becomes so incredibly tangled, and ways of espousing hatred for exactly the reason you say. My life is not as wonderful as it should be. It's the fault of, you know, and I suppose the one traditional target that we might blame it on is, in fact, the bankers. That what Charlie Coughlin was saying in the 30s and Ron Hubbard was saying in the 50s and 60s and many others. The bankers, those who run the hedge funds at least, have proved to be disastrously harmful to humanity. And as you said, because they run the lobbies, we've seen no regulation since the crash of 2008. And we have subprimes back again, you know, credit default systems back again for somebody's benefit.
Yeah, I wonder who that benefit is for.
Oh, exactly. And
I wish, well, I mean, for me, you know, it's very personal. For me, the only way I was able to transition from looking at another human being and identify them based on their race. You know, that person's Black, or that person's a Jew, or that person is Middle Eastern or South American or whatever, was to try to take it to a different level and to look at a human being more as a conscious being instead of, you know, like an animal.
Yeah.
You know, you look at animals and you see the different breeds. You know, I don't choose to see human beings like that. I choose now to try to see human beings more as a conscious, sentient human being that's part of a grand consciousness that has a soul, you know. And if you try to look at the human being in that context, it's much easier to not label them and judge them based on the color of their skin or what country they were born in or what country they came from. Or and then the second aspect of that is, you know, when you do feel bad, you know, instead of trying to rush to judgment and try to blame somebody else or blame something else, I find it was much more helpful to look inside, you know, and really inquire and say, you know, what is it that I really believe? You know, because every feeling you have is based on a belief.
Yes.
You know, if you're afraid of something, it's based on a belief that you have. And, you know, unless we're talking primal fear, but we're talking, you know, modern society now, which is mostly about, you know, mental illness, which is rampant in our society. And it's basically because, you know, we're not taught how to examine our thoughts. We're not taught to learn that we have a choice in which thoughts to attach ourselves to and which thoughts that we will allow to dictate how we feel. You know, because of, you know, what's going on in our society, massively polarized right now, how can you expect people to be well?
I
You know,
agree. I agree.
look at what's going on in our media every single day. How can you not be afraid? How can you not feel like crap when you hear the news and you see what people are doing to each other on a daily basis? It's madness.
It is, and it is a, you know, it's a form of social conditioning, isn't it? That I'm thinking about. There's a song in the musical South Pacific, which I think, you know, it actually came out in the early 50s, and this song about how you have to be taught who to hate, and which is about James Michener was interested in. And
have you ever read Eckhart Tolle?
A long time ago, a little bit, but
so in one of his books, he makes a statement that the human species is insane. You know, based on everything that we've done to each other over the last several 100,000 years. I truly believe that. We are insane. You know, I mean, we're doing the same thing over and over and over again. We're not getting better.
I recently finished a book called The Dawn of Everything, written by David Graeber and David Wengrow. David Graeber was a professor of anthropology here at London School of Economics, and David Wengrow is a professor of archaeology. And they revised the whole structure of prehistory, actually pulling together the real evidence and saying what we now know. And they found that there have been many, many different forms of society. And clearly in the Americas, in China, in India, there have been many different forms of society. And there have been societies that live peacefully. So, for example, in the Indus Valley, which is now Pakistan, Mohenjo-Daro, the Harappan civilization, they had 700 years without warfare.
Wow.
And
look at them now.
Well, look at what's happened. You know, it's a long time ago that came and went. Point is that it gives me hope that it has happened, that there have been societies which appear to have been egalitarian. They the thing about the Indus Valley is there were no temples and there were no palaces. 700 years. There also seems to have been a civilization in the Ukraine, which unfortunately archaeological work has stopped there, which similarly had a very long period of peace. And so I think that the problem is that predatory human beings so often take control of society. And in times of upheaval, then we have violent people like Timur or Genghis Khan or whoever, who explode into the world and destroy things. But there have been long periods of peace and long periods where people work together. It still surprises me when I think about it that we manage to get food through the incredibly complex process that, the shipping, growing things here and shipping them there, making sure they're still fresh when they get there. It's a remarkable statement about human capacity, but that we then don't manage to feed everyone.
No.
And this,
the amount of food that we waste.
Yeah, I mean, my father, who was a cosmopolitan, he traveled all over the world and worked as an export sales manager, and generally was a very tolerant and friendly man. But when the Ethiopian famine happened, he said, well, we shouldn't give them food because it will make them lazy and they won't work. And my response to that was, when Europeans arrived in Abyssinia, Ethiopia, they had 40% tree cover. They now have 5% because Europeans logged it. That means that the roots of the trees are no longer holding the soil in place, which means you have the process called desertification. That's a consequence of Europeans plundering that country. And of course, Mussolini didn't make it any better in the 1930s when he went and attacked them. So finding that balance, and the same was true with the potato famines in Ireland in the 1840s, that there was actually food at the docks, and the Home Secretary, the British Home Secretary, decided not to give it to the starving people because it would make them lazy. And given the choice between making people lazy and making them dead, and claiming to be then a Christian in the midst of all that, it's farcical.
Wow. That's certainly not looking at human beings at a different level, is it?
Yeah. And I have a very simple philosophy, which is for everyone enough, that I do see myself as part of a human family. As far as I'm concerned, we're all black, but some of us are slightly paler shade of black than the others.
And there's more than enough to go around.
Yes. Yeah.
It wasn't for, relatively, comparatively handful of ultra greedy people and corporations, and there would be plenty to go around, and we could possibly all be living in peace.
I think it's very possible if we look at what's being spent on military hardware and look at if we had that amount of money, which is the major part of our budgets now, if that could be put there to, you mentioned Finland. Finland doesn't have a homeless problem. I mean, homeless in Finland, it's pretty cold in the winter, so you're in trouble. But they've actually they've created a program that finds housing for everyone. They've made these little individual, tiny little apartments so that nobody is homeless. Their education system, every 2 years when the PISA tables are done, Finland's at the top. In fact, Scandinavia is at the top. Their literacy is way beyond the US.
Right, and it's either Finland or another country, close by. Their incarceration is absolute 100% rehabilitation, and treating people with dignity.
Yeah,
and it works, and it's been proven to work. Yet there's no interest in our country whatsoever for that.
No.
In our country, it's hatred. It's a criminal. They did wrong. They need to be punished. I don't care if it makes them worse. I want punishment. I want revenge. I want retribution, instead of let's help this person. let's take a look at why this person committed this crime in the first place. Are they mentally ill? If they are, let's get them help. Do they have no opportunity whatsoever? Okay, let's give them some opportunity. On and on. We don't look at it that way in this country.
No, nor in most places in the world. And it is that balance. I think to become civilized, we have to get past the idea of vendetta, the idea of revenge and the blood feud. The first Cherokee to go on record was interviewed in the 17th century by a Spaniard, and he said, "We exist to fight war. That's the purpose of our society, the Cherokee. We fight war." And this, curiously, is a matriarchal society run by women, as were the Northern Iroquois societies. So when people sort of get this simple idea, if we just let women run the world, well, there are some pretty nasty women out there too. It's not a matter of that. It's a matter of, you know, what your heart and mind is and the skills that you have. But I think people do separate out into, you know, those who feel the power of love and those who feel the love of power. And in between, there are massive people who've not, you know, they've been recruited into groups like QAnon. Which are, base themselves upon completely imaginary premises. You know, that Hillary Clinton's running a pedophile ring underneath pizzas somewhere or other. Pizza party.
It's an addiction. It's an idea. It's an addiction based on ideas.
Yes.
You know, and then there's the group of people that are just indifferent.
Yeah.
You know, they feel like they have no power to make any difference whatsoever, so they just abandon it. And they're complacent, they're indifferent, and, you know, in a way you can't blame them with the way things are set up. It doesn't really give you the sense in any way, shape, or form that you can make a difference.
No, and it is, you know, I mean, one of the things that's bothered me, because my study has largely been of religions, of belief systems, and how these imaginary worlds are created and people will live in, where they believe in things which they may be true, but there is no evidence for them. Right. And they then can tag their hatred onto these things and say, well, you don't believe in what I believe in, so you are therefore not a realized human being. The expression that's bothered me in looking at traditionalists is self-actualization. That people like Steve Bannon talk about self-actualization, some kind of spiritual enlightenment that's going to happen to people as long as, you know, they put Donald Trump back in power or something like that. Though, of course, Trump and Bannon have fallen out now. And it just seems childish to me. It seems incredibly immature to believe that, you know, there'll be a savior, a political savior who will come along and drain the swamp and make everything better. We have to be, each of us, ethical in our own lives. We have to be virtuous, you know, accepting that virtue is its own punishment. It's individuals that do that will make a difference. And Martin Luther King said it's not the evil people, it's the mediocre people, the people who do nothing. And that then you have the problem that when what they do is violent or hateful, and rather than it being some way of trying to change other people's minds, or even more so trying to change other people's emotions, because that's people we don't reason tremendously well. We don't necessarily realize that we feel something and we then justify it. That tends to be the way we behave.
Right. Yeah. Well, when we have a leader like Trump who was, you know, evil, who was malicious, who was revengeful, who was just a hateful human being, he espoused violence, you know, all that sort of stuff. You know, that I think tends to bring that out in other people that might otherwise not have gone in that direction.
We see certain values, don't we? The Plains people, the Cheyenne, the Lakota, they were well known for their generosity. And as you get up to the the peoples of the Northwest, around Vancouver and what have you, the Aleutian Islands, they have the potlatch where they seek to give everything away, but generosity becomes a primary virtue. I was quite surprised when I first read about that, because our culture is so much about being wealthy. In the Bible, and I'm agnostic, but in the Bible we have Jesus saying you can worship God or mammon, God or money. Those are the choices. I'm kind of going, didn't anybody, that seems to me a really simple, aren't we? Is that what we're meant to do? He who would follow me must give all that he has to the poor, all that he has to the poor.
Yeah.
These seem to be very straightforward instructions to me that, skip by the people that on a Sunday are going to their mega church or what have you. And so I think it is by our own behavior. And I think in those terms, from reading a book and getting to know you a little bit, that it's people like you that, and having role models, having people who have survived horrors and become compassionate human beings, knowing that can happen and knowing the consequences of that society changes because a different, something is seen as virtuous. So, having a huge amount of money should be seen as a negative thing. And, I don't mind people being wealthy. That's absolutely fine. But when you start, somebody like Elon Musk talking about spending $44,000 million to buy Twitter, he's got too much money, all in all.
Yeah. And he's got too much voice too.
Yeah, absolutely. And the man evidently has some problems,
Yeah, and look at our country. Most of the people that we idolize or we want to vote for are rich. Yeah. We idolize them because they're rich. I mean, should the president of our country be somebody that's rich? Or should the president of our country be somebody that's very, very wise? Somebody who is wise and compassionate and is a gifted leader? Or just some jerk like Donald Trump that happened to con hundreds of thousands of people out of their money to make himself rich? How do you admire that?
Yeah, man who's not bothered to pay taxes because he couldn't care less about anybody else.
Exactly. He doesn't give a damn about our country. He doesn't give a damn about our Constitution. He doesn't give a damn about the working person. Yet the working person is the first one that's going to give his life to save Donald Trump because Donald Trump is the man in their eyes.
Yeah,
massive disconnect there. Massive.
Yeah, he represents simple and impossible solutions that, the US is a country of immigrants, unless, of course, we're going to give it back to the first peoples and say, okay, we're all going back to Europe. Right. And I'm afraid that given the violence in the US, European descendants in the US would probably not be tremendously welcome back home in Europe. It's very unfortunate. Well, we've managed to do something like an hour here, which I'm very pleased with. You said many interesting things, which I'm sure will help our viewers to think about things in a different way. And so thank you very much, Kelvin. And
pleasure, John. As always, wonderful to talk to you.
Likewise.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.